In February 1960, U.S. Navy radar logged a dark object tumbling through a near-polar orbit, a path that, in that year, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could reach. The newspapers called it a mystery satellite. Some went further. They called it older than history itself, an alien craft that had been circling the Earth for 13,000 years, silent, watching, since before the first city was ever built. There's one problem with that story. There is no Black Knight satellite. There never was a single object up there at all. What there is a paper trail. A century of separate documents, each one real, each one with an ordinary explanation, welded together by people who needed them to be one thing. Pull the files in order, read them as they were written, and you don't find a spacecraft. You find how a ghost gets built. These are the records. Start with the oldest file in the stack, 1899, Colorado Springs. Nikola Tesla has built a laboratory high in the Rocky Mountain air to study the transmission of energy without wires. One night, alone with his instruments, he records something he does not expect, a signal. Rhythmic, repeating. Too regular, he is certain, to be a storm or an accident of the atmosphere. He becomes convinced he is listening to another world. In his own words, he calls it the greeting of one planet to another. The scientific establishment dismisses him, and here the legend makes its first move. It adopts Tesla as its founding witness. But read what the man actually wrote. He never says satellite. He never says Black Knight. He believes a planet, Mars most likely, is signaling him across space. That is the whole of his claim. And the signal itself has a quiet, modern explanation. Natural radio sources scattered across the galaxy, the dense spinning stars we now call pulsars, throwing off pulses at machine-like intervals. The catch is the date. Pulsars were not identified until 1967, decades after Tesla was already dead. He had no framework to name what he heard, so he reached for the only explanation his century offered him. Someone, out there, is calling. Move forward to the late 1920s. Oslo, Norway. An amateur radio operator named Jørgen Hals sends a signal out into the night and hears it return, but not in the instant it should take. Seconds later, 3, 8, 15. The same transmission, coming back long after it should have died. They are called long-delayed echoes. And here is the part the legend always skips. They are real. They are documented. And to this day, nearly 100 years on, science cannot fully explain them. The one genuine unsolved mystery in this entire story is sitting right here in a Norwegian logbook, and it has nothing to do with aliens. To turn it into something alien, someone would have to come back for it. 50 years later, someone did. Hold that thought. By the middle of the century, a ghost in the radio static wasn't enough. The legend needed something you could point to, something in the sky. 1954. A retired Marine Corps major named Donald Kehoe, by now far better known as a writer of popular books about flying saucers, tells the newspapers that the U.S. Air Force has secretly detected 2 satellites orbiting the Earth. Read that again. 2 satellites, 3 years before Sputnik. At a moment when no nation on the planet possessed a rocket capable of putting anything into orbit at all. If it were true, it would rewrite the history of the space age before the space age had even begun. But trace the claim back to its source. These aren't the minutes of an Air Force briefing. They are newspaper write-ups promoting Kehoe's latest book. The Air Force never confirmed it. The story was never substantiated by anyone in a position to know. And somewhere in the retellings, the name of Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer who discovered Pluto, gets quietly attached to it, lending a borrowed credibility that the record simply does not support. Then February 1960. And this one is different. This one is real. U.S. Navy radar logs a dark, tumbling object in a near-polar orbit. Time magazine reports it to the public. A polar orbit matters because an object on that path passes over every point on Earth as the planet turns beneath it, the perfect track for watching the whole world at once. Neither superpower will admit the thing is theirs. For a few weeks, it is a true unknown, and the press runs hard with it. But the Department of Defense already knew exactly what it was, a piece of debris from Discoverer 8. Most likely the film recovery capsule, the so-called bucket, lost when the satellite's eccentric orbit made recovery impossible. And Discoverer was a lie. It was the civilian cover name for Corona, America's first spy satellite program, built to photograph the Soviet Union from orbit. So yes, there was a cover-up in 1960. Men in power did hide the truth about that object. They simply weren't hiding a 13,000-year-old craft. They were hiding a camera pointed at Moscow. So far, the legend has a signal and a sighting. What it still doesn't have is a name or a story to hang on it. The next 2 decades supply both. 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper aboard Mercury 9 on his 15th orbit of the Earth. The legend says he saw a glowing object ahead of his capsule and that tracking stations on the ground confirmed it. It is told and retold as the moment a NASA astronaut saw the Black Knight with his own eyes. But go to the file. The mission transcripts don't show it. Cooper's own records don't show it. The single piece of testimony that supposedly proves the satellite is not, in fact, anywhere in the official account of the flight. It is a story about a document, told endlessly by people who never once read the document. The name comes next, and the truth of it is almost funny. Black Knight. It doesn't come from Tesla. It doesn't come from Halls, or Kehoe, or the Navy, or Cooper. The most likely source is a British rocket program that ran from 1958 to 1965, a test program named simply Black Knight, which was never designed to reach orbit and never did. A second candidate is a Soviet science fiction novel of the same era, featuring an alien probe sent to watch over the Earth. Either way, the conclusion is the same. The legend borrowed its name from fiction, and from a rocket that could not leave the upper atmosphere. And then, 1973, the Keystone. A Scottish science fiction author named Duncan Lunan returns to those long-delayed echoes, the ones logged in Norway half a century before. He does something nobody had tried. He plots the delay times on a graph, point by point, and in the pattern, he believes he sees a shape, a star map. It points, he says, to a star called Epsilon Boötis, Izar. He reads a date out of the diagram, an arrival around 11,000 years before Christ. A probe, 13,000 years old. That number, the one in every headline, every thumbnail, every breathless retelling for the next 50 years, comes from a single man reading shapes into a graph. And here's the detail the legend will never, ever put on screen. Lunan took it back. He publicly retracted the analysis. He admitted his method had been unscientific, that he had made real and basic errors. And for years afterward, he said plainly and repeatedly that the Black Knight conspiracy has, in his own words, nothing to do with him. The man who invented the 13,000-year-old satellite does not believe in it, which leaves the image, the one you have almost certainly already seen. December 1998, STS-88. The first space shuttle mission flown to begin assembling the International Space Station, the largest structure humanity has ever built in orbit. During the flight, the crew photographs a dark, twisted shape hanging against the blue curve of the Earth. It looks wrong. It looks worked, shaped, engineered. Within a few years, the images are everywhere online, captioned in the same 2 words, Black Knight. But NASA logged the object that same week, in the mission's own records. During a spacewalk, while the astronauts were bolting the early station together, the crew lost a thermal insulation blanket, one of the covers used in the assembly work. It drifted away from them. They photographed it as it went. It was tracked from the ground, fell out of orbit, and burned up in the atmosphere roughly a week later. The single most famous piece of evidence for an ancient alien satellite is a lost sheet of insulation from a construction job in 1998, photographed, cataloged, and fully accounted for in the paperwork of the very mission that produced the picture. Now lay the files out on the table, side by side, and look at them together. A signal Tesla believed came from another planet. An echo no one has ever fully explained. A flying saucer author's book. A piece of a secret spy satellite. An astronaut sighting that isn't in the transcript. A name borrowed from a failed rocket and a science fiction novel. A graph its own author retracted in shame. A blanket lost on a spacewalk. Not one of them describes a 13,000-year-old spacecraft. Each one, taken on its own, is something smaller, stranger, and entirely human. There is no object. There was never an object. There is only a century of unrelated paper, and a long line of people, each one reaching for the same explanation Tesla reached for in 1899, who needed all of it to add up to a single thing in the sky. That is what the Black Knight actually is, not a craft in orbit. A pattern we assembled ourselves, one document at a time, across 100 years and then mistook for a discovery. And the quietest detail in the whole stack is the one worth keeping. Buried in those files is a genuine unsolved mystery. The long-delayed echoes, still unexplained after nearly a century. It was never as sellable as aliens, so the legend walked straight past the one door that was actually still open, on its way to building a door that had never been there at all. The record closes on the Black Night, but it leaves a sharper question behind it. Because the echoes Halls heard in the 1920s, the ones science still cannot account for, were not the only signal someone tried to turn into a message. There is another file, another set of numbers, pulled out of the static that a serious researcher swore was a code sent from somewhere else entirely. The evidence was studied, it was published, and then it was quietly taken apart.